Okay, folks, I think we'll just get started. That's 8 o'clock. There was a flurry of people just coming on there, and we've got a lot to cover tonight, so I think we'll just get going. So welcome along to tonight's webinar through the Farm Advisory Service, and tonight we're going to focus on relinquishment and assignation of tenancies, with a kind of focus on opportunities for new entrants. So the relinquishment and assignation came into force February 2021, and I think it's fair to say it's very complex, and there's a lot of things to think about. So hopefully through tonight, after all of our speakers have spoken to you and addressed the audience, we should understand it a lot more, or it may generate a lot more questions as well. So we'll go through it and there'll be plenty of time for questions. We're also supported tonight by Scottish Land and Estates, NFUS Scotland, and the Scottish Tenants Farmer Association. So we have got a fantastic lineup of speakers this evening. I'm your chair, I'm Kirsten Williams, and I'm with SEC Consulting. And we have with us tonight, we have Bob McIntosh, Hamish, Ian Craig, and Tom Oates. I don't think any of the four of these actually need any introduction because they're all so well known within the rural sector, but we'll introduce them as we go along. But I think when you have a look and see who we've got here tonight, it is such a good opportunity to get to grips with this and to ask these guys the questions. So please don't hold back in asking anything. So our aim is for the panel to all address us. So they'll all get about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll have a good bit of session for question and answers. So you'll see in your bar, you'll have a Q&A kind of icon. So if you just click on that, put your question in, and then we'll put them to the speakers later on. And there's a huge amount to cover. It's a really big subject. So we're going to have a look at kind of overview, why it came about, who it's for, what it is, so the who, what, why, where, and when almost, and then how it actually works, how it's implemented, looking at the legal aspect, the valuations, and the tax implications. So first off tonight, we are going to start with Bob. And Bob is going to give us a really nice overview of what it is. Bob has got a tremendously varied CV. Where to start, I guess. He has held loads and loads of really influential roles, such as Scottish Government Director for Environment and Forestry and Director of Forestry Commission Scotland. As well as this, he's actually been a partner in a hill farm as well. So Bob, I'd really like to give you a warm welcome tonight, and I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Okay, as I said, I'm going to give a fairly high-level overview of the system, and the others will fill in the detail and handle the difficult questions, I'm sure. The reason the government brought this in was really to help provide an exit for particularly elderly tenants who might be wishing to retire and maybe have got no successors, but maybe feel that they perhaps can't afford to retire with just their tenants' improvements and the sale of their stock and their implements to fund their retirement. So what the legislation does is effectively allows a value to be put on the tenancy, which the tenant can benefit from when they quit the tenancy. And it was hoped that by making it easier for people in that position to come out of a tenancy, that would leave some opportunities for younger people wanting to get in, get a foothold into farming. So that's basically what was behind it. It's worth saying it's only available to 91 Act tenancies, the so-called secure tenancies. It's not available to anyone with one of the fixed duration tenancies. And although in theory it applies at least in part to limited partnerships, I think the reality is that it's not going to be of much use to anyone in a limited partnership. So really the 91 Act tenancies is what it's aimed at. In summary, a tenant can offer to sell the tenancy back to the landlord. If the landlord agrees to buy it, the value of the tenancy will be assessed by an independent valuer appointed by me, and the valuation will be done in accordance with the methodology set out in the legislation, which I'm sure the others will we'll cover in more detail. And if the landlord chooses for whatever reason not to buy the tenancy, the tenant has 12 months in which to try to sell the tenancy to a new entrant or a progressing farmer. And the definitions of new entrant and progressing farmer are set fairly wide. So unless that person already has a reasonable foothold in farming, there's a good chance that they qualify as a new entrant or a progressing farmer. There's no formula for valuing the tenancy in that situation. It's just a question of how much somebody is prepared to pay. And a person taking on the tenancy in that situation takes it on in the same terms as the outgoing tenant. The landlord doesn't have the opportunity to amend the rent or the terms of the lease when it's assigned to another tenant. And the landlord has limited ability to object to the person who the tenancy is being assigned to. Now that's the essence of the system, but as always, and as you might imagine, there's an awful lot more to it in terms of the statutory procedures and the deadlines and the timescales and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of fine detail to be filled in, which I'm sure the others will deal with. Just a few things I would say at this stage. Forget about the idea that a tenancy is worth 25% of the open market value. That sort of myth seems to persist, but actually the valuation is far more complicated than that, and worth pointing out, as the others will, I'm sure, that the age of the tenant may well have a significant impact on the value of the tenancy. And I would always recommend that a tenant would start with an informal discussion with the landlord if they're heading down this route. That might lead to a deal being done that respects the principles in the legislation, but without having to go through the statutory procedures, which can be a bit cumbersome and bureaucratic. So it's always worth having that discussion to see if it can be done without going through the statutory procedures. Last thing I would say is I have published a guide to the process which tries to describe the whole thing in layperson's terms, and that's available on the Land Commission website, or if you want a copy sent to you, a hard copy sent to you, please get in touch with me at the Land Commission and we'll do that. But unless you feel confident about going through the whole process yourself, I would always recommend employing the services of an agent. And that's a good prompt for me to hand over to Hamish and Tom, I think.
Thank you for that, Bob. And the guide that's been produced through yourself and the Scottish Land Commission is brilliant, and I'll actually put the link for it into the chat so that everybody can see where that is. I think Hamish and Tom, you're going to do a bit of a double act now, aren't you, between the two of you? I think Hamish is going first. Again, I don't think Hamish needs any introduction. He is so well known in rural Scotland with his knowledge, experience, understanding of the sector, and especially of tenancy matters. So I think we'll first off hear from Hamish, and then we'll move on to Tom. Tom's got a bit of a different accent from the rest of the panel, and he's based in the north of England, but he does do a huge amount of work up here in Scotland on tenancies as well. So I will hand over to yourself, Hamish.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you about relinquishment and assignation, and join with everybody else in saying that I hope that at the end of the session you'll have a much better understanding of what it's all about. The talk is, or at least Tom and I's section of the talk, is based on a seminar that we gave earlier in the year about this subject. Our thinking's developed a wee bit as we've developed more experience. But essentially, what I'm going to do is talk in some detail about the rules governing the new relinquishment and assignation procedures, time limits that are involved, some of the problems that we're beginning to see and the pitfalls, but also to highlight the opportunities both for outgoing tenants, new entrants and progressing farmers, and on some occasions for landlords too. So to begin with, what is relinquishment? Well, as Bob has already pointed out, it relates to secure 1991 Act tenancies only, and that includes 1991 Act tenancies held by limited partnerships. And there are a surprising number of limited partnership tenancies still in existence. As Bob has also pointed out, the value to general partners in limited partnerships is pretty limited, but I'll say something about that in more detail later on. So it was introduced by the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, which adds a new section 32A and subsequent sections into the 1991 Act, if anybody wants to go and read the hard black letter law about this. And of course, it came into force on the 28th of February of this year. So how do you start the process? The tenant starts the process, and the formal process begins by service of a notice of relinquishment on the landlord. Now, that's not something that you can sit down and write out in a single sheet of paper in 5 minutes and post it off to the landlord. It's quite a technical document with a lot of detailed technical requirements which have to appear in the notice. So the notice must include, I suppose fairly obviously, the name of the holding and the full details of the landlord and the tenant. It's got to set out the rent currently payable, and it's got to set out the details of the last rent review, including how the review was conducted and the rent previously payable and the result of the review itself. The notice must include a list of improvements, including dates, costs, and a copy of any agreement with the landlord about compensation. This is where those tenants who have gone through the tenants amnesty process and have an amnesty agreement in place will be at a distinct advantage, because all of that information about improvements will be in the amnesty agreement. The notice also has to have attached to it a copy of the lease and any agreements relating to the lease. And finally, the notice has to have attached to it a detailed plan conforming to various requirements, which in all honesty is going to have to be professionally drawn. So as you can immediately see, there is a lot of work required in advance before kicking off the relinquishment process. A lot of technical information, and it's almost inevitable that tenants who are going down this road are going to require professional advice and help to navigate them through the process. So there are certain restrictions on being able to serve a relinquishment notice. A tenant who is on the receiving end of a notice to quit can't, as a defensive measure, then serve a relinquishment notice. That's not allowed. Also, if the tenant has served a notice of intention to remove, it's too late for them then to exercise the relinquishment option and serve a relinquishment notice. That's quite hard to say halfway through a seminar on a Thursday evening. A tenant who's received a demand to pay arrears of rent or to remedy a breach of their obligation as tenant under the tenancy can't, as a defensive measure, serve a relinquishment notice on the landlord. So there are certain circumstances where the relinquishment route is simply not available to tenants. The Tenant Farming Commissioner has a formal statutory role in the whole process. When the tenant serves the relinquishment notice on the landlord, they must also at the same time serve a copy of the notice on the Commissioner, and the Commissioner has 4 weeks to appoint a valuer from a valuation panel which he's set up for that purpose. Landlord and tenant can agree a valuer in advance. It's important to notice that the tenant is responsible for paying the valuer's fees, and the Commissioner will obtain quotes from valuers in advance of a valuer being appointed. Now, given the detailed work in order to carry out a valuation, it's not going to be a cheap exercise. I'm not sure that there has been a formal valuation under the Act carried out yet. I suspect that there hasn't, but professionals tell me that it's likely to run into several thousands of pounds, and I think Tom will say a wee bit more about that. Either side have the option to object to a particular valuer being appointed, and if agreement can't be reached, then that would have to be resolved by the land court. I'm not going to say a huge amount about the valuation process because that's really Tom's thing, but the valuer has to operate within quite a tight timescale. The valuer has 8 weeks to complete the process, and during that 8-week period, the valuer must call on the landlord and the tenant to make submissions about value. The valuer's got to establish the open market vacant possession value of the farm, but leaving out of account any added value by the tenant's improvements. And then the valuer has got to work out what the sitting tenant value is, but the valuer has got to disregard the actual tenant successors and assignees. So essentially, you're looking at the individual tenant. How long is it that the landlord would have to wait in the ordinary course of events before that tenancy would come to an end as a result of the death of the tenant? So that's a bit of an actuarial calculation. The possibility of transferring on the tenancy is completely disregarded. And the sum to be paid by the landlord to the tenant, if the landlord wants to exercise the right to take the tenancy back, is 1/2 of the difference between the open market vacant possession value and the sitting tenant value, plus a figure equal to the compensation that the tenant would be entitled to for improvements, minus the cost of any dilapidations in relation to the fixed equipment on the holding belonging to the landlord, which the tenant is responsible for. So that's a bit of an exercise in itself, and I will pass over to Tom.
Okay, hope that works, guys. Thanks, Hamish, there, and thank you, Kirsten, for the introduction. Good evening, all. I would say about my accent in defence, actually, I do hail from the same area where Bob used to farm himself. So, Bobby, we are united in that front, hopefully. The valuation process, now, Hamish, like you mentioned, this is really quite a complex thing. Normally in these webinars, the agent gets to play a bit of the daft laddie. Unfortunately, in this instance, actually, it's probably the agent that has some of the technical stuff to go through. In this valuation process, there's a huge number of variables. I can't stress this. And there's a lot down to the valuation of experience, and it should not be taken lightly. So first of all, what is it to be valued? Hamish, as they mentioned there, we're talking about the value of the land it relates to. It's the vacant possession of the farm in its unimproved condition. That's an important point. The second point there was to look at the value of the land if it is sold with a tenant still in occupation, i.e. what someone would pay to essentially jump into your landlord's shoes with the current tenant in occupation. Then go look at the value of the tenant's improvements. Then we've got to consider the dilapidations. So, first things, let's deal with this myth that is out there. This was led in a headline by the Scottish farmer there that the value of the lease is worth 25% of the open market value. Now, can we please just deal with that one there? That is incorrect. It's dangerous to go there, but essentially the 25% rule, that is a myth and that is actually incorrect. We need to investigate the open market value of the farm, but that in itself leads to a number of problems. What we've got to look at, we've got to look at the farm in the unimproved condition, not what is there as at today. It is essentially in the unimproved condition. So we've got to look at what we call in the industry is black patching. Looking at what is there, ignoring the improvements that have been done by the tenant. So in this instance there, you'll see on the screen there, we've got steading, for example, where there is the things that have been provided by the landlord there in the yellow colour. There is the buildings that have been built there by the tenant, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 21, 24, 23. And then there is also where the tenant is contributed, the things there in pink. Now, these need to be disregarded in part of the open market value. it's very, very difficult to do, and it's not an easy thing to do, but need to be disregarded to get to the open market value. Also, do remember, it's not just the steading we're talking about. We need to consider the land as well. There's a huge amount of improvements being done with the land. For example, where land is now Region 1, previously it was Region 2, drainage works, breaking in, etc. We need to look at those. So, if we go back to the basics, what it is there, we've got in summary, we've got a 400-acre farm, and we've got a farmhouse, improved, look at it, there's basic value there. We've got a steading, very basic, what has been provided by the landlord. But if we were to say, in this example there, we're looking at, say, £2 million. Okay, then we move on to what is probably more of the difficult bit, and this is what the value with the tenant in occupation, the tenanted value. I think it's right to mention at this point there is a huge amount of variables in getting to the tenanted value. It is not just straightforward. There's variables on a number of things. But what you've got to look at here is what a landlord or what a person would pay to jump into your landlord's shoes. They're looking really at an investment in an agricultural holding where they've got a tenant in situ, where they're getting a rent in return, and, you know, believe it or not, there is still the potential of a right to buy. There's an enormous lot of things there to consider. And in discussions with a number of agents on these things, there's a vast amount of difference in opinion as to really what it would be. So factors to consider: who is the actual tenant? The age of the tenant, that's a very, very interesting point there. If you've got an 85-year-old tenant, there's going to be a difference in value compared to a 45-year-old tenant. And also, you know, we mentioned in the formal process, you do ignore the fact there's successors. However, it could be a relevant factor. In the formal process, we do ignore the fact successors. In a negotiation, it may be a relevant point. You've then got to actually understand as well the current rent that's passing. Now, in looking at the process, there has to be consideration: is the current rent that's passing an actual rent that the hypothetical tenant would pay? It may well be the rent hasn't been reviewed for a number of years. So in undertaking the value of the tenanted value, consideration may be given back to see what the actual rent is passing. The lease dates and the obligations, again, that's interesting. You know, it may be an old lease, which is not great for in tax purposes, for IHT, for landlord. And also there may be different obligations passed on there, post-lease agreement, minutes agreement, etc., changing over who has preparing and renewing responsibilities. So the valuation process. Again, I mentioned this is quite a technical thing there, and a lot of variables there. It takes a lot of time to go through this there. There may indeed be a lack of market evidence. Now, at the moment, I've got to say, land values are absolutely crackers. And to really put a firm value on what land would make on the open market is very, very difficult because of the current demand. We need to consider there's a variable there potentially on the yield on the rent. Some may consider a low yield because it's secure income, secure investment. Others may say, well, hang on, you know, we've got a slight insecurity here, want a higher yield and return. Again, this is down to the valuer's judgment. In the formal process, there is this thing, a valuation person, called the term and reversion. So the term basically looking at the likely life expectancy of the current tenant, how long, in all honesty, they would potentially be there. And then you've got to look at the reversion to the open market value. Again, these are all slightly judgmental. It's certainly not A plus B equals C. And also there is a number of variables we put on those very points indeed. So we get the tenanted value. So in this instance there, you recall we had an OMV, open market value 2 million, but we've looked at the term reversion, and we've come to an investment value there of 1.1 million. So we've got the main two parts done. So there's the land relinquishment payment, the value of the lease. Split in the vacant possession premium. That's the difference between the open market value and the investment value. So the VP, £2 million, looking at the tenanted value of 1.1, the investment value 1.1, gives a vacant possession premium of 900,000. That is divided by 2 to give a sum due to the tenant of £450,000. Now that's the first stage. We then go on there. I mentioned the valuation uncertainty in there. The next stage we look at is the improvements. Now the improvements again are very, very interesting. Hamish mentioned before that those who've done the valuation, so done the amnesty, you are a long way down this line. Your improvements have probably been clearly identified. It's a great, great document there. And so it is there. It's not just the buildings. We're looking at other things here. We're looking at the land improvements as well. Now, again, there's variables in this calculation because the value for the improvements is the value to the incoming tenant. Again, it's not straight A plus B equals C. It's certainly not a straight line depreciation. That is now null and void. So again, there's much to be considered in this there, and a lot of it down to the values experienced. So the valuation of the improvements can actually run into significant figures again. Hamish mentioned there the dilapidations. Now, we need to consider dilapidations in the round there, because is it true there could be a claim for dilapidations? If there's no formal record of condition from the commencement of the lease, it's difficult that a dilapidations claim may stand. I'm not saying it wouldn't stand, but it may well be difficult to make once there's the absence there. So, galloping through this there, in summary, what we've got here in this instance, we've got a vacant split the vacant possession premium at 450,000. We've got the tenant's improvements that we assessed to come to 250,000. There's no dilapidations because there was no record of condition. And that means the total sum due to the tenant in this instance as part of this formal relinquishment part is 700,000. Now, Hamish, I thought was important. We went through, appreciate this is all about the opportunities. However, it's important to actually convey the detail of the relinquishment value to the tenant as part of this process, because this is the value that will be posed to the landlord, who would have to say, thank you very much, I don't want there, in order that this tenancy now can be offered further. I'll hand you back to Hamish at that point.
Thanks, Tom. I hope everybody can see my screen. So just to have a think about potential pitfalls. One of them is, we've talked about how detailed the relinquishment notice is that has to be served on the landlord, and a copy goes to Bob as the commissioner. There's no obvious mechanism within the Act about how disagreements are resolved if the landlord happens to disagree with the contents of the relinquishment notice. For example, it might be as basic as just exactly what is covered by the tenancy and so on. There's no mechanism, it would appear in the Act, about how to resolve disagreements between the landlord and the tenant about what the improvements are or what the dilapidations are. Now, less scope for argument perhaps about improvements if there's an amnesty agreement in place already signed by the landlord and the tenant, that's fine. But in relation to dilapidations, for example, the landlord doesn't know that a relinquishment notice is coming necessarily, and the first opportunity that they'll have to react is when they get served with a copy, and then they'll try perhaps to draw up a schedule of dilapidations that they want the valuer to take into account. They make representations to the valuer about that. What does the tenant do if the tenant disagrees that the dilapidations are set out accurately, or takes the view that there are no dilapidations for the reasons explained by Tom? Once again, it's not particularly easy to see how those sorts of disputes are resolved, and there's no apparent provision to press pause on the procedure to allow that to happen. Now, I suppose in practice, it might be that somebody would apply to the land court for an order from the court resolving whatever the disagreement is. But the problem, it seems to me, is that there's no provision within the 2016 Act which gives the Land Court authority to intervene and suspend the relinquishment until the argument is sorted out. I think there is a limited scope to resolve disagreements right at the outset, because Bob has 4 weeks within which to appoint a valuer. And if a landlord is complaining about the accuracy of a notice straight away, then the appointment of a valuer can be delayed until that's resolved. And I think that would be on the basis that it's not apparent that a proper notice has been served. But those are just some of the issues which perhaps make the idea of a tenant having a discussion with the landlord to see if a private negotiation is possible might be a bit more attractive. So let's presume a proper notice was served. Let's presume the valuer is appointed. Let's presume that the valuer has managed to produce a valuation within that 8-week period. And let's say, for example, that the valuer has identified that the relinquishment value that the landlord has to pay is £750,000, as per Tom's example. The landlord has an opportunity to accept the valuation and then has a period of 6 months to pay the valuation figure, in which case the tenancy is surrendered and the tenant gives up vacant possession and moves away. The landlord has the opportunity to decline to exercise the relinquishment. So the landlord can look at the figure and say, I can't afford to pay that, or I'm quite happy for that farm to remain in a tenancy, and as long as the incoming tenant is suitable, I don't particularly mind if it continues as a secure tenancy, and I'm not going to pay that sum of money to get it back. Or it might be that the landlord says, yes, I am going to take the tenancy back, but doesn't actually pay within the 6-month period. In any of those events, the tenant is then able to sell the tenancy on the open market to either a new entrant or a progressing farmer. Now, there is a detailed valuation formula in arriving at the figure that the landlord has to pay to the outgoing tenant, but there is no regulation whatsoever in respect of the sum that a new entrant or a progressing farmer has to pay to the outgoing tenant in order to buy the tenancy. That's going to be purely a function of the open market. So just moving on from that, it's important to spend a little bit of time to understand who a new entrant is for the purposes of the legislation. A new entrant is somebody who doesn't hold a relevant interest and hasn't held a relevant interest in the last 5 years, and after purchasing the tenancy won't hold more than one relevant interest, the tenancy being the relevant interest. So what's a relevant interest? A relevant interest is where a tenant or where someone holds an agricultural tenancy, but you ignore, for the purposes of working out if somebody has an interest or not, a short limited duration tenancy with less than 3 years to run. A small landholder or a crofter who occupies more than 3 hectares of land is a relevant interest, so that person wouldn't be a new entrant. Someone who owns more than 3 hectares of agricultural land in aggregate holds a relevant interest, so they are not a new entrant for the purpose of the legislation. If someone is a partner in a partnership or a shareholder in a limited company, where they have a share of at least 50% or more of the company or the partnership, and that company or partnership holds a relevant interest, then that person is deemed to hold the relevant interest, and they are not a new entrant either. A progressing farmer. Progressing farmer is somebody who doesn't hold 2 or more relevant interests, The relevant interest is the same for a progressing farmer as it is for a new entrant. And the progressing farmer won't hold more than 2 relevant interests after purchasing the tenancy. Where the progressing farmer has a relevant interest, which is the interest as tenant in a tenancy which is going to run out in less than a year, that's not counted as a relevant interest. So if you think about it, a partner in a large farming business who has less than a 50% share of the partnership, that business could have multiple relevant interests, but that person could still qualify as a new entrant or progressing farmer. An individual person might be the tenant in a secure agricultural tenancy who is the neighbour of the tenant looking to relinquish his tenancy, but because that's his only interest, he's a progressing farmer. So he is eligible to buy that tenancy. Likewise, the neighbour might be somebody who owns a 1,000-acre unit. That 1,000-acre unit is counted as a single relevant interest. So I think that before the detailed rules were promulgated earlier this year, there was some debate about how restrictive the new entrant or progressing farmer categories would actually be. But actually, when you look at the definition of relevant interest, particularly in relation to progressing farmers, actually the range of eligible acquirers is much wider, perhaps, than we'd expected it to be before the detailed rules were published. I did say that I would say something about general partners and relinquishment. So those are general partners in limited partnerships, where the limited partnership is the tenant under a secure tenancy. They're able to serve a relinquishment notice on the landlord. They go through exactly the same valuation procedure as an individual tenant would who wants to relinquish the tenancy. The big difference is that if the landlord chooses not to exercise the right to buy the tenancy back, pay the valuation sum to the general partner, the general partner doesn't have a right to sell the tenancy to a new entrant or a progressing farmer. So of course, the right, although it exists on paper, is actually of very little value indeed, because the very nature of a limited partnership tenancy means that the landlord is able to bring it to an end, usually within a relatively short timescale. So it's difficult to imagine why a landlord would pay a valuation figure to a general partner in a limited partnership in order to get the tenancy back, when it's within the landlord's control or power to bring that tenancy to an end in the relatively near future anyway. So that's a look at who is a new entrant and a progressing farmer. And I'm going to pass back at this stage to Tom, who's going to have a detailed look at the nature of the opportunity that is now available to new entrants and progressing farmers, where tenancies are available for purchase on the open market.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Hamish. Now, I think this is where we're getting to the crux of really where Kirsten wanted to go to with this there. And I do think that this is a fascinating bit of legislation there, and it does create a massive, massive opportunity. Now, slide there. Firstly, I do apologise. In order to be a young entrant or a progressing farmer, you do not have to be male and young, and you do not have to have a Lexian combine. But hopefully you get the gist of where I'm going with this there. It's really a question in here as to why you would want to pay to become a tenant. It's a psychological, but there is an awful lot of logic behind it why someone would want to do so. But before we go there, just the point that Hamish made before there, there's an awful lot of sort of stipulations, the classes there. just be slightly careful, because you might want to have a second thought if you're looking to try and secure additional grant or additional subsidy by maneuvering people into being primary owners or partners in a business there. Just be careful, because you might limit yourself in terms of opportunity for new tenancies. So question is, okay, why do you want to buy into a tenancy and become a secure tenant? Well, first of all, you're going to avoid this very, very competitive nature. You're going to avoid standing around that ring and bidding against and forcing as one another there, bidding on the open market for the actual sort of open market, the LDT, etc. Now, there's serious competition out there for tenancies at the moment. I mean, I'll give you a few examples. The Crown Farm across at Lockerbie there was 63 applicants for it. The lettings on Butte last year, there was 35 for one single LDT. And recently, just in the past few days, I know there's a state that there's a potential farm coming up. It's not even on the market yet. I know the fact I had 10 phone calls on Monday morning about it, people speculating, was there a chance to get this in this farm there? So there's a huge, huge amount of competition there for LDTs. And no matter what process the factors or landlords or agents go through in selecting a tenant for an LDT, some will slip through the net. So by actually buying the secure tenancy or buying the opportunity to become the tenant there, you can potentially avoid this process. So realistically, what are you actually getting a hold of with this opportunity? You are actually purchasing the right to jump into the existing tenant's shoes. So you're jumping into their shoes. You are becoming the tenant under a 91 Act lease. And in this scenario, you are getting to use a farm, which we've said has got a vacant possession value of £2 million. And for that privilege, you're going to pay an annual rent of, say, £20,000 for it. You are going to be securing that farm for many, many generations to come. It's not just yourselves, it's the future generations as well. And also, you are looking at rent under the 91 Act agreement. So there is a degree of protection under rent. But let's consider that point, okay? The rent on this farm currently passing is what you'd have to pay is £20,000. On the open market under an LDT, that same farm could easily let for 40, 50, maybe more £1,000 a year. So say, for example, we said it was 50k. So that's a rental saving of £30,000 per annum. If you were to say 25 years, that's £750,000. That's the value of the relinquishment there. So is it worth you offering, say, £750,000 so that you are able to jump into the shoes now and become the tenant? Okay, you're still going to pay you £20,000, but you are secure there. The next thing, what you're also purchasing, you're purchasing the improvements. Okay, so in the sum that you offer to become the tenant, you're offering a sum for the lease, but you're also offering a sum for the improvements that the previous tenant has done. Now, you need to consider, are these properly registered? And also what their value will be. Now, the interesting point here, and it reverts back to the valuation process, don't forget, improvements are not going to depreciate on a straight line methodology. The method of assessment is the value to the incoming tenant. So say, for example, if you pay £100,000 for the improvements on this farm now, who's to say in 20 years' time those same improvements will be worth less than £100,000 in 20 years? Sounds like a pretty good investment if you pay for it now and get the same money back in 20 years' time. And furthermore, if you do further improvements, you might get your money back for them again. So say, for example, you build another shed, costs you £30,000 to build a day, You use that same shed for the next 20 years, you might get 30 grand back for it at the end of the day. It's the value of the income tenant. It's not the cost of what it is there and the straight line depreciation. And that's a very, very important thing to remember. So you're paying for the lease, which you can get back in the rental saving. You're paying for the improvements, which actually might not be dead money. You can get it back. The big issue, of course, is the finance and how to get finance to buy in. Not everyone has cash in the back pocket. And one of the issues, and let's be open and honest about it, is able to get finance for this. Now, the lease itself is not considered a secure asset to lending. Yes, the lease has a value. However, you could irritate that lease today and the value falls immediately. And accordingly, the banks will not treat that lease as a secure asset to lend against. Now, the improvements themselves, that's an interesting concept, because with this day and age, if the improvements are properly registered, even if the tenant goes bust, then the landlord still has to compensate for those improvements. So therefore, it could be considered they are a secure asset. Now, there's an awful lot of education to go through with some lenders on this. Although, interestingly, just yesterday, I had a request from a bank asking me for a letter of comfort as to the value of improvements. I haven't actually yet provided it because I don't know whether I can legally, but it's interesting that the banks are now looking at improvements as a way that they can try and provide some finance for it there. Just taking another example there, becoming a tenant may well be a great opportunity for those who have a small owner-occupied unit, a small owner-occupied, say a 200-acre unit. They could use that unit to secure the lending to go into a larger, say, 1,000-acre tenanted unit. So they could significantly upsize, progressing farmers, etc. They only have one unit, but they could use the collateral in the small unit there in order to significantly expand their farming enterprise. So just to conclude there, I've got to say, I think this is a massive, massive opportunity. You know, you could be jumping into a situation, you could be there for generations. It could be a cheap way into a large farming unit. And don't forget, you could always sell it on at the end of the day as well. And furthermore, the valuation process, which is touched on in the earlier part, okay, the first point is the open market value of the land. So therefore, the value of the lease itself logically will rise as the land values, as the capital values rise there. So you may have an asset escalating in value. I've got to say, it's a great opportunity. I think some of these will actually come around. I know that one may well be happening next year. Be interested to see where it goes. But that's sort of my bit done there. And I'll hand back to Kirsten, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, both Tom and Hamish. A huge amount of information there. And as I say, if anyone wants anything further clarified or go over anything again, then please pop it into the Q&A icon there and we will come back to it. So we've got our final speaker of the evening, Ian Craig. And Ian is based in Perth as a partner with Azets, and he actually specialises in a range of different things: accountancy, business advice, taxation advice, and he is a fantastic speaker to conclude this evening. So Ian, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. So I'm just going to cover off some sort of key tax points, I suppose, that come into play in these transactions. I mean, there's generally sort of 2 or 3 taxes that are to be considered in terms of VAT, land and business transaction tax, but probably the most important one is capital gains tax. And in fairness, it's probably more of an interest to the outgoing tenant than the new entrant or the progressing farmer. Because the outgoing tenant typically is looking at, once they've established a value, whatever that may be. They're most interested in how much of that value can they protect and retain potentially in their retirement. The other point I would say, though, is that even though it's more of a, I suppose, an interest to the outgoing tenant, it's probably quite important for a potential interested party, be it a new entrant or a progressing farmer, to understand it from the, I suppose, the seller's point of view. One thing just sort of to highlight early on, before I get into some more detail, is that there's a form of tax relief called business asset disposal relief, which was formerly known as entrepreneurs relief, and basically any gains up to £1 million for an individual are taxed at 10%. So why am I telling you this? Well, you know, if you're looking at a retiring farmer coming out of his tenancy, and let's say a value is arrived at of the figure that Tom presented earlier, 700 or 750,000, and you're retiring and giving up farming, then in a worst case scenario from a capital gains tax point of view, you're talking, you know, 70,000, 75,000, which sounds a lot, but of course we want to try and investigate, you know, what can the outgoing tenant do to try and reduce that even further. And in terms of that, there's quite well established case law on notices to quit. Now, notices to quit from a landlord is not the legislation we're actually dealing with here. The legislation we're actually talking about is new legislation in terms of the Relinquishment and Assignation. But I'll just quickly run over the notice to quit provisions, because I think it's quite important just to kind of touch on those to see where we've come from and how that may translate into where we are with the Relinquishment and Assignation. So typically, if there's a landlord serves a notice to quit that's accepted by the tenant, and a figure is agreed between the both parties, you would typically try and allocate that payment into different buckets for tax purposes. So, for example, you probably look to seek in terms of the statutory compensation, to portion some to disturbance and reorganisation. So if you have, let's say, a rent passing of £10,000 a year, you would get a multiple of 5 of that, which would generally be exempt from capital gains tax. Then you may look at the tenant's interest in that lease. So if the tenant lives in the farmhouse and that's his only residence, his main residence, you may try and apportion a sum from the compensation as his principal private residence and get some further capital gains tax relief there. And then you look at the tenant's improvements in terms of what may be exempt there. And then you're really trying to squeeze down to what's remaining being the value of the tenancy. And it's the value of the tenancy in that scenario that is the asset for capital gains tax. So in an outgoing tenant scenario, whatever figure you start with a well-worded agreement or negotiated agreement, you generally be looking to reduce the amounts that are subject to CGT and take advantage of the exemptions. I would also just mention as well, typically there's a sum allocated to unexhausted manurial values, whether that's fertiliser or limes or whatever. That's generally subject to income tax. So that's the position with a traditional notice to quit scenario. But where it's, I suppose, with this new relinquishment and assignation legislation, that is instigated by the tenant, which can potentially produce quite a different tax outcome for the outgoing tenant, and dare I say, less favourable potentially. And the other point I would also say is that because the legislation is so new, HMRC have not actually given any guidance to the tax profession on on specifically on this legislation. So we're sort of left in a little bit of a situation where you think, well, how does this work from a tax point of view? I mean, my view on it is if it's a properly, a proper relinquishment situation, which is a statutory provision, then you should be able to get a reasonably favourable outcome for capital gains tax. But if you're looking at an assignation, in other words, selling your tenancy to a new entrant or a progressing farmer, then that is, I think, fairly clear that that's just a sale of an interest in a tenancy and a capital gain. And therefore you would end up paying more tax in that situation. But I suppose you have to balance that potentially with, well, am I going to generate more value by doing that? And actually, if I'm going to generate more value from an assignation, then you may be prepared to pay more tax to achieve that, and therefore an outgoing tenant may be better off potentially if that could be achieved. The last point I would sort of cover, and it's not really a tax point, I suppose it follows on a little bit from what Tom was talking about in terms of financing. I mean, the banks looking at a tenanted business, whether that be a limited duration tenancy, which I appreciate a different animal from a secure tenancy, but a limited duration tenancy of 10 years. The banks probably wouldn't want to finance any more than maybe 7 or 8 years in a 10-year lease, whereas in a fully secured tenancy that's acquired, I suspect the banks are able to take a longer term view on a fully secured tenancy because it's not got a sort of defined end date. And I know from generally speaking, banks will lend up to 20 years to a fully secured tenant. I suppose the interesting or the unknown, and which Tom's already touched on, is what value are they going to lend against? Are they, if you pay 700,000 for a tenancy, and they're probably going to discount that, I suspect, at least for risk purposes. I think typically a bank would probably look to lend up to maybe 50% maximum loan to value. So for a new entrant farmer, no matter which way you look at it, you are going to have some access to capital in order to buy a tenancy, and in that, on that, the banks will look at not just the loan to value ratios, they will also look at debt serviceability. So it's important, as everyone will have to do anyway, to buy the tenancies, create a business plan, is to look at what their commitments are going to be, into the future, and those commitments they'll have to measure are, hire purchase payments, bank debt, personal drawings, and if those figures are, for easy maths, £100,000. Then the banks would be looking at profitability of generally a factor of 1.25 above that. So, that's just to demonstrate what sort of profitability that may be needed. I think it is a good opportunity, the new legislation for people to buy in. But I think in terms of, there is a requirement, I would say, to have a degree of savings to get in, or at least perhaps from a progressing farmer's point of view, some ability to leverage off an existing business. Would be how I would sort of view it. But certainly, but on the tax side, as ever, it's typically something that anybody, an outgoing tenant, probably maybe isn't necessarily thinking about first and foremost when they're coming out of their tenancy, but it's probably a conversation that needs to be had relatively early on between the land agent, the valuers, and the solicitors as well, to make sure that things are properly allocated for tax purposes to try and maximise retained value. So I think that's all I was going to say. And I'll pass back to you, Kirsten.
Super, thank you very much, Ian. A huge amount of information has just passed in the last hour. I know my brain is going 1,000 miles an hour, so I can only imagine what everybody else is doing. And there are plenty of questions coming in as well. I'm just going to address the one question, and well, I'm going to address a lot of the questions, but just to clarify, somebody had sent a question into the chat and Hamish has replied to everybody. So I'll just let you know what the question was that Hamish was answering. And that is, if a tenant sells tenancy, if a tenant sells a tenancy, is the landlord liable for the improvements? So that is the chat that Hamish just put in. I'm going to start with you, Bob, if that's okay. And there is a question around timings. So you are the land commissioner, so the letter comes in to yourself to have 4 weeks to assign a valuation. And the valuation then can take, was it 6 to 8 weeks? And with tenancies generally starting either November or May, how kind of time sensitive is it for when these need to or come into place for people to be watching for?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, timing is a difficult one because the legislation, as Hamish said, doesn't give any opportunities to extend the timescales or any idea of how to deal with disputes that arise during the timescales. So what I've been saying to people is, for goodness sake, if you're putting in a notice of intention to relinquish, make sure you get all your ducks in a row first with all the relevant information. It'll be particularly important to have agreed your tenant's improvements with the landlord. If you stick in a notice of intention to relinquish, which hasn't got an agreed list of tenants' improvements, that's going to gum the whole process up. You can guarantee it. And the valuer's job is to value the improvements. He's not there to act for you or the landlord and trying to argue what is a legitimate improvement and what isn't. So it's really important that all this information that's needed is right up there at the start. All the information about the lease, the maps, agreed tenants' improvements before you stick in a notice of intention to relinquish. And the only way I can try and ensure that we don't get in a mess is that if someone sends in a notice of intention to relinquish that comes to me that hasn't got all that information, I'm going to reject it as not being competent. And at least that hopefully is some way of making sure that when the clock starts ticking, the thing's ready to go. But as Hamish said, there will undoubtedly be things that will crop up during the process, and maybe we'll just have to be a little bit flexible around what the legislation says about timing, because I don't think anyone will object, actually. Hope not anyway.
Hamish, you've got your hand up. Do you have something to add to that?
It was just really to make the point, Kirsten, that the notices don't have to be served against the term dates of the tenancy. So it really doesn't matter if the tenancy began at Whitsunday or Martinmas. The tenant can serve the notice at any time during the year. So it's not a notice served against 28th November like a rent review notice or 28th May. As soon as the tenant's got his notice ready or her notice ready, they can just serve it.
Okay, perfect. There is various questions. I'm going to work my way through them. So we've got one from James asking if, so this I think is kind of trying to clarify the new entrant and the progressive farmer, and it would be if say he was taking seasonal grazing over various different places, would that mean that he would be a new entrant or a progressive farmer? I'll maybe start with you with that one, Hamish, if that's okay.
So An interest as a grazing tenant isn't a relevant interest. So somebody could have half a dozen grazing tenancies because of the nature of their business, but none of those would qualify as relevant interests. So they, in fact, would be treated as a new entrant under the legislation.
Okay. And Bob, I'm going to come back to you again, because the next question kind of goes on from that slightly, in that we've got these two statements. We've got a new entrant, we've got progressive farmer, but what is the actual difference in the opportunities to each of them, or are they just both treated the same with a different name badge on them? Bob, you're on mute.
Yes, as far as I can see, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. I mean, you can come forward as a new entrant, or you can come forward as a progressing farmer. And if you qualify under one of those two definitions, then you're eligible for taking on the tenancy.
Okay.
Hamish or Tom, can you say any reason why the two things would be distinguished in any way other than the eligibility?
It's just eligibility. What was behind the proposals originally was that they would give a route into the industry for people who were genuinely new entrants, or for people who were progressing farmers. And the original thinking of the Agricultural Holdings Legislation Review Group was that people in existing limited duration tenancies, for example, who were coming to the end of their 10-year tenancy or their 15-year tenancy, would be a progressing farmer who would be looking for opportunities to progress in their business. But as things have actually turned out, the definition of a progressing farmer is very much wider than perhaps had originally been envisaged.
Okay, thank you. Tom, I'm going to come to you next just to keep you awake. In the example that you gave, when we were speaking about age of the tenant and how that kind of impacted the value, can you maybe explain that a little bit more and give us maybe some brackets of age or something just to explain it a bit further?
Okay. When we sort of mentioned the age of the tenant, the value, this is down the relinquishment valuation process, and this is down the formal valuation process if you apply to Bob and get a formal valuation done. Now, under that process, it's a term and reversion valuation. So, say, for example, you had a tenant in there who was, say, 75 years of age. What you'd be doing the valuation, you'd be looking at the average life expectancy for tenants, and say, for example, the average life expectancy was 85 years. So you'd be looking at the term of, say, 10 years, 75 to 85 years, before that farm would revert to open market value and return to the landlord. So you are essentially looking at the rent for the 10-year term and then reverting to the open market interest. If you looked at the other situation, say you had a 45-year-old tenant, average life expectancy 85 years, so you're looking at a term of 40 years before that farm reverted to open market. Now, there's valuation tables in there, but hopefully you can see that if you're looking at an extra 30 years before the farm reverts to the open market, that is significantly less an investment value than it would be for a farm that only had 10 years to revert. An investor would offer significantly more if he only had to wait for 10 years for the farm to revert to open market value. Now, that is purely down the relinquishment side of things. If you're looking at the opportunity to buy that tenancy, that necessarily wouldn't come into it because it's a different process. That is what the open market would pay for you to become the tenant. Okay, so really the age is only relevant in the formal relinquishment process. If relinquishment is done by negotiation, you're not necessarily talking term and reversion.
Perfect, thank you.
I hope that answered that without confusing people too much. Sorry, I do apologise. I can't reach it enough. It's not a simple valuation process, and you need to really have some guidance through this. It is not a lot of the industry, the professional bodies have got their heads around this, never mind the layman.
I think Bob's advice at the very start of this webinar with seek professional help was ringing out the further we go into this topic, I have to say. Ian, I'm going to come to you next, and it's somebody asking about where if you bought a tenancy, where that sits within your accounts. So would it sit in your balance sheet as an asset, and would that cause any tax implications to a new entrant?
So yes, it would be capitalised onto your balance sheet as an intangible asset, I suppose. I guess a proportion of it will be improvements, but ultimately it will be capitalised and depreciated over the, well, we would typically depreciate it in the accounts. From listening to what Tom was saying earlier, possibly that is incorrect, because at the end of your tenancy, it may shouldn't be. But in terms of depreciation, I mean, ultimately what the tenant is concerned about in our purposes is income tax. Actually, the depreciation of an asset doesn't get income tax relief anyway. It's an improvement by nature. So yes, it would sit on your balance sheet as an asset, is the short answer.
Super. There's a question here that I'm going to start with Bob, then move to Hamish and possibly Tom as well. And it is looking at any stumbling blocks that might be imposed by a landlord during the relinquishment process. Bob. Sorry, Bob, we can't hear you.
It's going to depend on what the landlord wants to do at the end of this, whether he wants to buy the tenancy or whether he's content for it to be passed on to another person. If he wants to buy it, then it'll be in his interest to minimize the value that he's going to pay, obviously. So yes, there'll be plenty of scope to disagree on what a tenant's improvement is, disagree on other aspects of the lease perhaps, and make the most of dilapidations if he's able to do so. I mean, these are the sort of ways in which I think the landlord would try and minimize the value to him, which I guess is understandable.
Hamish, Tom, anything to add to that?
I suppose that if the landlord was trying to stop it, they might object to various factual details in the notice, and you could guard against that by making sure your notice was perfectly in order before you served it. If the landlord didn't like the value, not only do they have the option to say, well, I'm not interested in buying it, they also have the right to appeal the valuation figure to the Lands Tribunal, and the tribunal would then set the figure. So depending on how far a landlord wanted to go, there are a number of things that they could throw at the relinquishment process to try and slow it down, or indeed just wear the tenant down.
Okay. Tom, did you have anything further on that one?
The only point I would make is that what we're talking here is this is big game. You know, we're talking significant sums of money here, and this process is something that shouldn't be entered into like a marriage lightly or whatever it is there. But no, but it's deadly serious. There, there's an aversion to paying fees and costs, and I totally appreciate that. However, get the advice at the early stage here and get your hand held through this process, because it's very, very easy to slip up and make some catastrophic mistakes at an early stage here. And you need to know which way to go at certain junctures in the whole process, because you could really shoot yourself in the foot if it's not properly advised throughout.
So it's really well documented. It's spoken about often that new entrants opportunities are, but the biggest stumbling block for opportunities is finance, sourcing finance. And there's somebody asking, is there a way that they could make it more affordable in a way that they pay the tenant out over a period of years? So say it was stretched over a 5-year period rather than finding the lump sum at the start. Bob, do you want to have a go at that one?
Well, if we're talking about a situation where the landlord has not wanted to buy the tenants back and the tenant has assigned it for value to another tenant, then that's a matter for the two tenants, the outgoing and the incoming, to come to an agreement. I mean, by and large, the person coming out is going to want all the money up front, but they might be open to some sort of deal where the purchase price, if you like, is paid over a period of years. That's a matter for negotiation between the two parties.
And I guess, Ian, for the outgoing tenant, if he's winding up and retiring, he or she, then how attractive is that?
Not attractive at all. I mean, ultimately, what you'd probably have there is the outgoing tenant receiving his consideration by instalment and having to pay all his tax up front. And I suppose there's probably a commercial risk that what happens if the new tenant fails. Yeah, I'd be surprised if that could be done in the real, in reality. But maybe if you had two, maybe in a family situation or something like that, potentially.
I have to say there was a huge amount of questions.
But yes,
in.
I mean,
If I could jump in there, Kirsten, slightly, actually, under the relinquishment with the landlord deal, there's a number of deals that I have done where there has been stage payments undertaken. Now, that has possibly been a way to slacken the blow to someone stumping up significant sums, and it has eased the pain. Now, Ian's quite right. There's, and this is where it goes to the accountant there. The tax comes into things. However, if it's a case of getting the deal done and it becomes a stage payment, and that's when we rely on likes of Hamish there to make sure there's sufficient security or whatever security lodged to guarantee the next stage of the payment. So that is when the relinquishment back to the landlord. Totally agree with Ian's point there that if you are looking about an incoming progressive or new entrant, there's got to be a high degree of risk, because like a secured lender, is there anything secure in case anything goes wrong?
Okay, there's a big theme actually with the questions that have come in. There's a lot around finance, and just Tom, when you were doing your last section, there was, just before you put up the slide with the bank logos, they were coming in thick and fast. Will people actually borrow against it? Is it an asset? How will they look against it? And how do they go about finding the money? So it's definitely a big theme here in the questions this evening. Yeah,
it's a big theme, and I'm an agent for AMC, and so I've had a lot of discussions with AMC about it. I've not spoken for the banks at all, but literally as we speak at the moment, they will not treat a tenancy as a secure asset to lend against. It may well be, as time progresses, there could be some further education. I mentioned there before the improvements, because they could be considered more of a secure asset. And yet it's a problem. And it's one of the biggest stumbling blocks there is out there. And that's the way it, can't be around the bush. But it's something that may well progress over time, with a wee bit more education. As I say, I recently had a letter from one of the main banks asking for a letter of comfort to do with the value of improvements. So they were clearly considering it. I don't know how they were treating it in terms of the lender, but they were considering it, certainly.
One of your points as well, when you were saying that land values are pretty insane at the moment and they're increasing, then that is hopefully something that's quite favourable with the banks, that's your asset. Hamish, I'm going to come to you next, and it's actually, if you've already got a tenancy and it says in your tenancy agreement that you should reside on the farm, there is only one person or one family, and they buy another tenancy that also has that. Where do they live? How do they go around that?
So the law about that actually changed in 2003, so that if you have a tenancy where there is a residence clause which obliges the tenant to live personally on the farm, that clause is of no effect if the tenant arranges for somebody suitably qualified in agriculture to live in the farm. So that the family farming business, which suddenly has 2 tenanted farms, are going to have at least 2 individuals who are capable of farming each holding. So you just place a family member in one farm, a family member in the other farm, and you don't have to worry about the residence clause because there is somebody suitably skilled living on the farm.
And if you don't have another family member?
Then you would need to employ a farm worker or somebody who was involved in the active farming on the farm itself.
Okay. We've got loads of questions to get through, but I'm very, very cautious of time, and we said we'd finish at 9:30, so I'm going to stick to that. We've got one here, and it's a reminder. So I think we did go through some stuff quite quick pace, so it's maybe just taking a step back, and it's asking if we can clarify how you get to a suitable figure for buying the tenancy through a direct approach. So actually going to the person and thrashing it out. Obviously, you do have to have your professionals involved and everything else, but how do you come round to a figure if you go for a direct approach to a landlord? Is it quite similar to if you go through the relinquishment? And I think I'm going to start with Bob for that one, and then maybe go a bit around the houses.
Well, yeah, because you've got to think that if the tenant sits down with the landlord to do a deal, if the tenant doesn't think it's a good deal, he can always revert to going through the formal route. So whatever deal the landlord does has to come up with a figure that's not a million miles away from what would happen if they went through the formal process. So I guess in some ways you've got to go use some of the same methodology to get to that figure, but you're doing it without the burden of all the time scales and the bureaucracy and the procedures and things. But Tom will be able to say a bit more about that.
Handing nicely over to you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an awful lot of discussion to be undertaken, and there's an awful lot of drivers in various discussions. So, you can do the underlying principle of the values are the same, though, that it's quite a complex thing. And so whilst you can go and sit down and try and thrash it out, I mean, you could agree whatever. You could agree to go for £1. The landlord might suddenly come and offer you £3 million if you wanted to go. There's nothing to say there's right or wrong there. But if you were to try and sit down and just simply thrash it out, you'd probably need some advice in the process.
Hamish, anything to add to that one?
You are going to have to get some professional advice. I mean, there are lots of private deals done with landlords where tenants are bought out, but unless the tenant gets some professional advice about the underlying values involved, it's pretty hit and miss on their part, and it would be false economy not to get some valuation advice. Or indeed to engage an agent to help with the negotiation. But the main advantage of a deal like that is, as Bob points out, you're not constrained by time limits and notices and so on and so forth. So the parties are negotiating with each other at a time scale that suits themselves. But it would be difficult to do without some detailed information about values, because how would you know that you were striking a good deal?
Ian, anything to add?
Not a huge amount. I'm pretty sure does the there's quite a number of valuers that are already listed as approved to give advice on this field. So if it were me and a client approached me, I'd probably point them to, I think they're all listed on the Tenant Farmer Commissioner's website, potentially. They're all on there, so I would probably just pass the buck as the accountant on back to the valuer, to be honest. It's probably not something that, tax professionals would probably want to get involved in.
Yeah.
Kirsten, maybe if I could just come back and say, I'm aware that there are a lot of discussions going on between landlords and tenants on relinquishment. I've only had 2 formal notices of intention to relinquish, which does suggest that most people are, at least as a starting point, trying to negotiate deals outside of the statutory procedures, which I think is very sensible.
And Kirsten, on that note, there are instances out there where, as a result of private discussion, landlords have said that they're really just not interested at all in acquiring the tenancy back from the tenant, and have given the green light to the tenant to be able to advertise it for sale on the open market, as long as the person purchasing is a new entrant or a progressing farmer, so that the tenant in those instances hasn't had to go through the procedure at all. So that, and I suspect as time goes on and people become more comfortable with the way that things work, those sorts of opportunities are going to become more frequent.
Thank you. So to round up, I'm just going to go round the houses with you all and just ask, so our audience tonight is aimed for new entrants, the opportunities that it brings for new entrants. What, thinking of trying to gain access to land, get into a tenancy, what would be your biggest bit of advice to give to somebody looking at either getting into a tenancy, looking at relinquishment and assignation as an opportunity? Some people I know have been waiting a long time for the legislation to come in because it has been spoken about for such a long time. So what advice would you give them? And I'm going to start with Tom.
I would say start the discussion early, so you are prepared for when the opportunity arises. Don't wait for the opportunity. Get your ducks lined up so you know where you can go and how you can go. And what I generally find, what people think is available, when you go through the process, more and more things become an option that they didn't think at the start. Start the discussion early and get prepared.
Thank you. Ian.
I think, I said at the beginning, tax is not really an issue for the new entrant. They're not majorly considering it, but it's probably important to understand the landlord's point of view, the outgoing tenant's point of view. And most farmers that I deal with, I've spoken to over the years, that are outgoing tenants, they want their farm to go to somebody that they like, and they're going to look after it and farm it the way they like it farmed. So probably to try and build a bit of rapport and relationship and understand it from the outgoing point of view. And it's like buying anything you like, sell something somebody you like. That's probably what I would recommend.
Thank you. Hamish.
As far as it's possible, try and build up some capital reserves so that when you go to a lender, you can demonstrate that you've got your own capital to be able to put towards the investment. And the more confidence that a lender has in you as a new entrant, the more likely it is that you're going to get some sort of funding package to help take up one of these opportunities when they become available.
Finally, Bob.
Yeah, I was going to say use the land matching service. It's available. It may be able to match you up with an opportunity. It's worth trying that. And if you do see a tenancy coming onto the market through the relinquishment and assignation process, then, as Tom said, push the boat out to go for it, because that's the only way you're going to get a secure tenancy these days. Landlords aren't going to offer them in any other way. And having a secured tenancy is a hugely valuable thing. So it's really worth pushing the boat out to try and get a hold of one.
I think what you've said there about the land matching service, an absolutely brilliant resource there with the Scottish Land Matching Service. You'll find them. Google it. You'll come across their website, and there's two fantastic advisors there ready to help and chat through various different scenarios as well. So that's a really good shout there, Bob. I think as well there's always the same hurdles discussed, isn't there, with them gaining access to land, gaining finance are so common. And I know relinquishment and assignation, when it started to get spoken about and now it's come forward, there was a lot of people really excited that this is going to be the thing, this is going to bring the opportunity. And I have to say it's slightly disappointing that it came in February and you've just had 2 letters, Bob. What do you think is stalling it? Why isn't it going faster?
Well, I wouldn't judge it by the fact that I've only had 2 formal notices, because as I said, there are a lot of discussions going on outside of the statutory process. So I think the big question mark is in how many cases will the landlord buy it back, and in how many cases will the tenancy be sold on? And that's what will decide whether there are opportunities for new entrants or not. A lot of landlords will want to buy the tenancy back if it's a reasonable figure, because it's probably the only chance they'll get to get back a secure tenancy. So there's a big question mark over how many of these discussions will result in tenancies becoming available, I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have hit 9:30 and I will stick by my promise. So I want to thank the 4 of you so much for this evening. I don't know how I'll sleep tonight with all this in my head, so good luck to everybody else managing to. But thank you very much. If there's anything following after this, then please just give us a call. You can go onto the Farm Advisory Service and there's a helpline there, so you can give us any of our questions. You'll also be sent a feedback form tomorrow, and it's just trying to gauge how you found this evening. It's really worthwhile doing. As well as giving us feedback, there is also a £50 voucher that is drawn every month. So the chances are high and it's for local bakeries or for butchery shops to spend the money on. So well worth doing your feedback. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the speakers, and good luck with your journeys of finding tenancies. Good night.